Emily had already been turned away. The door closed behind her quietly, the kind of quiet that lingers longer than noise, the kind that makes you feel like you were never meant to be heard in the first place. No argument, no explanation, just another rejection added to a growing list she had stopped counting. She stood there for a moment, her hand still wrapped around the handle of a worn envelope, her chest rising slowly, as if even breathing had become a decision. But what happened next was something no one in that house could have prepared for, because within minutes, the same people who dismissed her would be calling her name, rushing toward the very person they had just overlooked, and by then, it was almost too late. Why did they suddenly need her, and what had they missed? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. At first glance, Emily didn't stand out. There was nothing about her appearance that demanded attention, nothing that signaled importance in a room where impressions were made within seconds and judgments even faster. No expensive clothes, no polished confidence, no familiar name that carried weight. Just a quiet woman sitting upright, hands folded carefully over a worn envelope, waiting for a chance to speak that never truly came. To them, she was forgettable, replaceable, easy to dismiss. But hidden beneath that quiet presence was a story tied to that very house, a connection that ran deeper than anyone in that room could have imagined, a history that had quietly unfolded long before this interview was ever scheduled. It was a story no one bothered to ask about, not because it wasn't important, but because no one thought it was worth hearing. And that decision, made in a matter of minutes, would soon become something they could not ignore. Because the questions they failed to ask in that moment would return to them with urgency, with regret, and with consequences they were not prepared to face. Who was Emily really, beyond the silence they misunderstood as weakness? Why was she rejected so quickly, without even the courtesy of a real conversation? And what did the family discover in the moments after she walked out? Something so significant that it would turn dismissal into desperation. Because not long after she left, there would be tears, there would be voices filled with panic, and there would be a realization, heavy and undeniable, that a mistake had just been made. A voice would say, quietly but firmly, "We made a mistake." And somewhere in the background, a steady hospital monitor would echo a truth they could no longer avoid. Emily's life had never been easy, but it had always had purpose, the kind of purpose that doesn't come from recognition or reward, but from showing up when it matters most. For years, she worked quietly in places most people rarely think about, caring for people who had slowly faded from the center of everyone else's attention. The elderly, whose stories had outlived their audiences. The sick, whose days were measured not in plans, but in moments. The ones who needed patience more than anything else, the kind of patience that cannot be rushed or taught, only given. Emily had that patience. She had a way of making people feel seen, even when the rest of the world had already moved on, and she did it without expecting anything in return, without keeping score, without ever thinking someone might remember her for it later. But life has a way of shifting without warning, and for Emily, that shift came quietly. The facility where she worked reduced staff, budgets tightened, and just like that, the job she depended on was gone. There were no long goodbyes, no real explanations, just a brief conversation and a final paycheck that would not stretch nearly far enough. Suddenly, the steady rhythm of her days was replaced with uncertainty, and the small sense of security she had built for herself disappeared almost overnight. Yet even then, Emily didn't have the luxury of focusing only on herself, because waiting for her at home was someone who needed her more than ever. Her grandmother had been getting weaker, not all at once, but in small, quiet ways that became harder to ignore. A cough that lingered longer than it should. Fatigue that turned simple tasks into exhausting efforts. Medication that ran out faster than it could be replaced. The kind of decline that doesn't announce itself loudly, but settles in slowly, until one day it becomes impossible to overlook. And so, without hesitation, Emily stepped into the role she knew best. She became the caregiver again, not in a facility this time, but in a small home where every decision mattered more, where every dollar had to stretch further, where every moment carried weight. She cooked simple meals, the kind that filled the space with warmth even when there wasn't much in the cupboard. She helped her grandmother walk from one room to another, steadying her with quiet reassurance, never rushing her, never showing how heavy the responsibility sometimes felt. At night, she would sit with a small stack of bills, counting and recounting, trying to make sense of numbers that refused to cooperate, knowing that something would have to be delayed, something would have to wait. And in between all of it, there were quiet moments, the kind that never make it into records or reports, where she would simply sit beside her grandmother, listening, holding her hand, offering a presence that could not be replaced. Emily never complained. She didn't see herself as extraordinary. To her, this was simply what you do when someone you love needs you. But what she didn't realize, what she couldn't have known in those quiet, ordinary days, was that her past, the work she had done without recognition, the lives she had touched without expectation, had not disappeared the way she thought it had. Some people come into your life for a moment, others stay until the very end. And somewhere, in a place she had just walked away from, that truth was about to find its way back to her. Emily arrived at the house earlier than scheduled, standing for a moment at the edge of the driveway as she took in the size of it, the stillness, the kind of quiet that felt different from the one she was used to. This was not the quiet of a small home filled with effort and care, but the quiet of something polished, controlled, and distant. She adjusted her grip on the envelope in her hand and walked toward the door, each step measured, each breath steady, as if preparing herself for something she could not yet define. From the outside, everything looked perfect, but the moment she stepped in, something felt off, not obvious, not immediate, but present enough to settle somewhere in the back of her mind. The room she was led into was bright, carefully arranged, every detail in place. Yet the atmosphere carried a weight she couldn't ignore. The people seated across from her looked composed, but there was a distance in their expressions, a kind of quiet evaluation that didn't feel welcoming. Their eyes moved over her quickly, not lingering long enough to understand, just long enough to decide. Emily sat upright, her hands resting calmly, waiting for the conversation to begin, but even before the first question was fully asked, she could sense the direction this was going. The pauses were too short, the glances too quick, the tone already set before she had a chance to speak. She began to answer, carefully, respectfully, choosing her words with intention, but it didn't matter. One of them leaned back slightly, exchanging a brief look with another, and then came the words, delivered in a tone that sounded polite but carried finality. "We'll let you know." It came before she could finish, before she could explain, before she could offer anything that might have changed their impression. The conversation ended as quickly as it had begun, leaving no space for clarity, no opportunity for understanding, just a quiet dismissal that felt heavier than it sounded. Emily nodded, not because she agreed, but because there was nothing else to do. She stood, gathered herself, and walked toward the door with the same composure she had carried in, even as something inside her tightened. By the time she stepped outside, the air felt colder, sharper, and she allowed herself a single breath that carried more weight than the ones before it. She walked down the driveway slowly, holding back the emotion that threatened to rise, not wanting to let it surface where it could be seen, even if no one was watching anymore. It wasn't just the rejection, it was the way it happened, the feeling of being unseen, unheard, as if everything she had done, everything she had been reduced to a moment that no one took the time to understand. And yet, as Emily reached the end of the driveway, something inside the house shifted. Not loudly, not all at once, but in a way that would soon become impossible to ignore. Inside the house, a conversation began, the kind that starts without intention and slowly gathers weight as pieces fall into place. At first, it seemed ordinary, a few passing remarks about the interview, a quiet acknowledgement that another candidate had come and gone, nothing unusual, nothing worth revisiting. But then one name was mentioned, almost casually, as if it had simply slipped into the conversation without warning, and yet the moment it was spoken, something changed. Mrs. Carter. The room didn't fall silent immediately, but there was a pause, subtle and brief, the kind that signals recognition before understanding fully arrives. For a moment, no one said anything, but the name lingered, carrying with it a memory that hadn't been revisited in a long time. Their mother had relied on someone in her final years, someone who had been present when the rest of them could not always be there, someone who had taken on responsibilities that were never simple and never easy. At the time, it had been handled as a necessity, arrangements made, schedules discussed, details managed from a distance. But now, as the names settled into the conversation, those distant decisions began to feel closer, more personal, more real. One of them leaned forward slightly, as if trying to recall something just out of reach, while another shifted in their seat, their expression tightening with a quiet uncertainty. They began to connect small details, not all at once, but piece by piece, fragments of memory that had been overlooked or forgotten. There had been stories their mother used to tell, brief mentions of someone who had stayed longer than expected, someone who had been patient, someone who had made those final months feel less heavy. At the time, it had seemed like a passing comment, something said in gratitude but not fully explored. Now, those words carried a different meaning. Old photographs came to mind, images tucked away, moments that had not seemed significant before but now felt important. They remembered the way their mother would smile when she spoke about that time, the way her voice would soften, the way she would mention someone who had made a difference without asking for anything in return. She used to talk about someone, one of them said quietly, the words almost hesitant, as if speaking them aloud would confirm something they weren't ready to face. Someone who never left her side. The realization didn't arrive all at once, but when it did, it was undeniable. They began to look at each other, not with certainty, but with the growing awareness that something had been missed, something important, something that had just walked out of their home without a second thought. Could it really be the same person, the quiet woman who had sat in front of them just moments ago, the one they had dismissed without question, without curiosity, without recognition? The possibility settled in, heavy and unavoidable, and with it came a shift in the room that could no longer be ignored. And that's when they realized who they had just sent away. The realization settled in slowly, but once it took hold, there was no way to ignore it. Emily was not just another applicant who had walked through their door that morning. She was the one who had been there during the most difficult chapter of their mother's life, the one whose presence had quietly filled the spaces they themselves could not always reach. While others worked in shifts, coming and going as schedules allowed, Emily stayed. She stayed through the long nights when sleep didn't come easily, through the silence that often followed unanswered questions, through the pain that could not always be eased but could be shared. She had been there not out of obligation, but out of a sense of care that went beyond what was expected. In that moment, the distance they had maintained from their mother's final days began to feel different. What had once seemed managed and organized now felt personal, filled with details they had not taken the time to fully understand. Their mother had not just been cared for, she had been accompanied, supported by someone who chose to remain present when it mattered most. And yet, when that same person sat in front of them just minutes ago, they had not seen her for who she was. They had not recognized the role she had played, the impact she had made, the quiet consistency that had defined her presence. But their mother had remembered. In the fragments of conversations they now recalled, in the warmth that had accompanied her words, in the way she had spoken about someone who treated her with dignity and patience, there had always been a sense of gratitude that they had not fully explored. She treated me like family. The words echoed now with a clarity they had not carried before, no longer a passing comment, but a reflection of something real, something that had mattered deeply in a time when everything else felt uncertain. The weight of that understanding moved quickly through the room, turning hesitation into urgency. Chairs shifted, voices rose slightly, not in panic but in realization that action was needed, and needed immediately. They could not let her leave, not without acknowledging what they had missed, not without correcting a decision that had been made too quickly. One of them moved first, heading toward the door with a sense of purpose that had been absent just moments ago, the others following close behind, the quiet composure of earlier replaced by something more urgent, more human. Outside, Emily was already making her way down the street, her pace steady, her thoughts her own, unaware of what had just unfolded behind her. The distance between them was not far, but it was enough to matter, enough to make each second feel more significant than the last. As they stepped out and called after her, their voices carried something different now, something that had not been there before. "Wait, please, we need to talk to you." And for the first time that day, they were no longer looking past her, but directly at her, trying to reach someone they had only just begun to understand. Emily stopped when she heard her name, the urgency in their voices carrying further than the distance between them, but she didn't turn immediately. For a brief moment, she stood still, as if deciding whether this was something she needed to face or something she could simply walk away from. When she finally turned, there was no anger in her expression, no visible frustration, just a quiet composure that made it harder to read what she was thinking. The same people who had dismissed her minutes earlier were now standing before her, their tone different, their posture changed, their certainty replaced with something closer to humility. They began to speak, offering explanations that felt incomplete even as they said them, acknowledging that they had made a mistake, that they had not taken the time to understand who she was or what she had meant to someone they loved. They apologized, not quickly, not casually, but with a sincerity that came from realization rather than obligation. They spoke about their mother, about the things they were now remembering, about the stories they had overlooked, and the way those memories now carried a different weight. Then came the offer, presented with care this time, not as a dismissal disguised as politeness, but as an opportunity they wanted her to consider seriously. The job was hers if she wanted it, but more than that, they wanted to help her, to support her situation, to make things easier for her and for her grandmother. It was more than what had been on the table before, more than what she had come for, and yet Emily did not respond right away. Because for Emily, this wasn't just about a job. It was about dignity, about being treated with a level of respect that should not depend on recognition or memory. It was about being seen for who she was, not just when it became convenient, but from the very beginning. She listened to them, not interrupting, not dismissing their words the way hers had been dismissed, but allowing them to finish, allowing the moment to settle before she made her decision. There was a quiet strength in the way she carried herself, a clarity that came from knowing her worth without needing to prove it. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, measured, and clear. She acknowledged what they had said, accepted their apology without hesitation, but she also made it clear that moving forward would require more than a corrected decision. She set boundaries, not out of pride, but out of understanding, making sure that what had just happened would not be repeated, not for her, not for anyone else who might find themselves in the same position. It was not a rejection, but it was not immediate acceptance either. It was a moment of balance, where respect was no longer assumed, but established. In the end, the agreement that followed was not just about employment, but about recognition, about creating something that reflected the value that had been overlooked before. They had offered her a position, but what they gained was something they had not expected, a chance to correct more than just a single decision, a chance to understand the impact of what they had nearly lost. And as Emily walked back toward the house, not as someone being called back, but as someone choosing to return on her own terms, the meaning of that moment settled in fully. Kindness matters, even when it goes unnoticed. People remember how you treat them, even when you think they won't. And respect is never something that appears on its own. It is something that is earned, often in ways that are only understood much later. In the end, it wasn't Emily who needed them. It was them who needed her. Have you ever been judged too quickly or overlooked when it mattered most? In a moment where all you needed was to be heard, to be understood, to be given just a little more time before someone made a decision about you that they couldn't take back? Think about it carefully, because moments like that don't always come with a second chance, and not everyone gets the opportunity Emily was given to turn around and be seen for who they truly are. Would you have gone back if you were Emily, knowing how easily you were dismissed, knowing how quickly people formed opinions without asking the questions that mattered? Or would you have kept walking, choosing to protect your dignity over giving them another chance to understand you? It's not always an easy decision, and for many people, it's one that stays with them long after the moment has passed. Let us know in the comments what you would have done, because your perspective matters, and your story might resonate with someone else who has faced something similar. And if this story touched you in any way, if it reminded you of a moment in your own life or changed the way you see others, don't forget to subscribe for more powerful real-life stories that stay with you long after they end. Because the next one might not just be a story you watch, it might be one that changes the way you see people, the way you listen, and the way you choose to respond when it matters most.